Oh,
I took a little knitting class.
Okay.
We
Yeah,
are teaching at the Rainbow Bridge.
Okay. Do you know anybody? Well, we hadn't met formally, but I'm so pleased to be able to meet you in person.
Yeah, some of our
Happy to
former
meet
colleagues.
you and all of your experience.
It's great that you're here now of Capstone, and we're grateful to have you, and we're really grateful for your patience.
Fine. I was just lucky to get here because I was at a doctor's appointment this morning. I'm like,
Oh.
but it was so
Oh, good. And I'm saying this live, but because I am committed, I hope we can go on a field trip, like a mini field trip to California.
Which would be great.
I would love to
Yeah.
be there. Thank you so much.
We should go on a
Quite
bus.
an operation.
Yes, it is.
So for the record, I'm Sue Minter. I'm the Executive Director of Capstone Community Action. And I do want to say, full disclosure, I do have a background in planning. I did work at the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, as it was called then, in the Community Planning and Downtown Revitalization Program. So I do have some background about some of what you're pondering. But I am bringing a different perspective, wearing a different hat today. But I think the big picture that I want to share is we need to advance all of the ways that we can reduce barriers to building more density, more housing, more diverse housing types, to meet the needs of all income groups, racial and ethnic groups, but also to support Senator Brock, not just in our designated centers. I really want to hope that maybe you consider putting in here something about mobile homes, critical work, and of course, emergency shelters, which I know you currently are addressing. I think the chair invited me to give you some perspective on the context of the most vulnerable Vermonters that we, on whose behalf we need to accelerate, especially rental housing, but all types of housing. So I want to just recognize also joining us is Ramsey Pack, who works, she is the housing team manager. Capstone is one of 5 community action agencies in the state, and our service area is here in central Vermont, covering Lamoille, Washington, and Orange counties. But all of your constituents are served by my sister organizations, and as a network, we are called VCAT, the Vermont Community Action Network. We have an annual report here to share all the incredible work we do. And I want you to know that, you know, we do a lot of different things because poverty is very complex and multifaceted. We support your weatherization efforts for low-income Vermonters. We do micro business development that your body has also supported, particularly during the pandemic, through special grants for micro businesses. We have financial counseling and literacy. We have workforce development programs. I will say during this pandemic, our most critical and really expanded services are around crisis services, including housing. So community action agencies partner with all kinds of other organizations to, you know, it takes a village. So while we don't build housing, we partner with our housing partners like Downstreet in central Vermont, Lamoille Housing Partnership, and others. And every one of my colleagues around the state partner as well as with shelter providers. For us, it's the Good Samaritan Haven. I will say that community action, which has a long history since 1965, we really grew out
Was
of
that when it was?
the war on poverty was an outgrowth of
Vista volunteers.
that's right. Senator Cummings knows she's a part of our
And then
movement.
it was on your board for almost
love
a
that.
decade.
That is so great. And then you became a mayor and then a senator.
That's right.
Amazing. And yes, we have an incredible legacy growing out of the civil rights movement. And we continue to really focus on economic and social injustice in every way. So we provide crisis services, and then we build ladders of opportunity to help people out of poverty. That's the big picture. But each of our 5 organizations are independent nonprofits with independent boards of directors. And I could go into detail, but I will keep moving. I did submit some testimony, so if you are more interested, there's more to learn. I think I did want to say that back about, I think, 20 years ago, Down Street Housing was a project of what was Capstone's predecessor named the Central Vermont Community Action.
CVCIC.
So we are an incubator of other nonprofits. I want to acknowledge our partners, but especially I think in the room somewhere was Sarah Phillips, who you heard from earlier, who the Office of Economic Opportunity oversees our work and is really our partner. And particularly throughout this pandemic, I will say that the amount of work we have done grew exponentially with respect to crisis services. And I'm talking about food and housing services. Thank you for your support of the Vermont Everyone Eats program, of expanded SNAP benefits, so many ways that we have been supporting people. And I want you to know it has been an extraordinary time. Our partnership with the state has been incredible. They have worked so hard. Our teams have grown, our work has grown. The hard thing now is that we are really seeing the precipice of so many of these pandemic support programs ending. And that's kind of the moment that you are in. And I think you may have heard testimony about the VRAP, the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program, closing. That is going to affect, and it's going to be before you, beginning with your budget adjustment bill, looking at what is the state going to do with the number of folks in emergency housing. I've submitted in testimony, and I have here the data, just to remind you that right now in January, we have 1,800 households, which includes 2,204 adults and 621 children. So those are the folks that we most concern ourselves in our work at Community Action. You are thinking a lot about communities and where they build and how they build, and hopefully lowering the barrier to building many more housing units, all kinds of units, greater density, greater diversity. What we do is support the people, because you are far less aware, as I was, and now have become far more aware of the challenges, the barriers that individuals have to successfully being housed. So I have a list actually in my testimony of all the kinds of services we provide to folks to make sure they not only get into a unit, but are successful in that unit. And in that way, we partner with landlords. One of the elements of the VRAP program that concerns me greatly, and just to underscore the urgency of this moment and of your job, is not only are the over 2,000, over almost 2,000 households about to lose access to the motel program, but tens of thousands of Vermonters have had rental assistance to enable them to stay in apartments. For many people, and we have the job of helping them sign on to the online portal, which was not an easy process. And for people who only have a flip phone, that's what we did 24/7. I mean, lots of folks get onto that program. Unlike all the other programs we have, there were very low barriers. You basically had to attest to being impacted by COVID. This has enabled people to stay and get into some apartments. It's enabled landlords to increase their rents to get perhaps a better return on what they need to maintain their. But what we foresee as a problem, and I'm sure you'll hear more of this from Legal Aid, is the amount of people who are in apartments over their head without this rental assistance, which they had assumed and been told they had 18 months of. And now that is ending prematurely or before they had expected.
Earlier than anticipated.
Earlier than anticipated. For all kinds of understandable reasons, but the reality is we've got really serious challenges, not only of people in hotels, but of people in units they cannot afford. And we don't have real numbers on that. I do want to.
I was going to say, the VRAP numbers are what? Because the 1,800 are the motel community,
Right.
not the VRAP. And the VRAP, figuring out a an exit strategy from that assistance is, I think, key, but I don't have a sense of how many people are getting VRAP help.
The best Vermont State Housing Authority will have those data.
Right.
But it's very hard to know from that how many will not be able to afford any longer. We know that it's a lot of people coming to our doors. And the anxiety of knowing this is coming, not having an option, and it's the lack of options. Throughout this pandemic, we've been able to hire staff, and it's been a rocky road, and I can finally tell you we are full in our housing department, but we have the staff to do the support, the services we almost never have. We have the vouchers to support them, many of which are ending. There's no units. And so there is no exit strategy.
Right.
I will say also for many of the folks, and I know you're not dealing with it necessarily in this bill, but I think you are tangentially, many of the folks who we call are chronically homeless are people who haven't been able to be housed successfully for over 18 months. The majority of people have very serious substance use challenges, mental health challenges, and need clinical supervision and need places that can be where they can be appropriately and safely housed. This is a huge need that I hope lowering some of the barriers that you're trying to do for emergency shelters and other kinds of facilities will help. We deinstitutionalized our mental health facility and believed that the community would provide shelter. We have not been able to keep up with that promise. And it's a problem that you are going to see more and more, and you hear about it across the country. So I have to share that with you. I want you to know we've actually been able to provide housing for people as well. And I do want to end with the unhoused, but just to make sure you know, in Washington County, we were able to house stable housing for over 100 households, including 45 children. We run Head Start programs, so we work very hard with families with children. The Community Action Network is really looking at how do we strategically focus on ending family homelessness, focusing on children who are homeless, and the ripple effects and generational impact of 620 children. 30% of the people we serve in our Head Start are homeless. And I'm talking about families who come to us, their parents live in a container. They live in a container. This is what I hear from my staff. And it's so hard to believe and to comprehend. So I'm sorry to be emotional, but my staff expect me to share their stories with you. I'm going to read a few stories. A woman fleeing domestic violence with her 2 children. They had been homeless since 2018. We helped her find housing in August 22 with VRAP and HOP funding. She expected it to last for 18 months. She will receive 70% of the benefit until the program ends. Her current rent is $2,000 a month. Her income is 30% AMI or lower, and it is very unlikely she will ever be able to afford the $2,000 a month rent. A man on a fixed disability income, also 30% AMI or lower, lived in the same unit for 10 years. The building was sold, the rent increased. VRAP was able to save him from eviction, but the landlord has raised the rent again and intends to raise yet again. He is worried and terrified that he will be evicted and cannot afford any other units on the market. A single father works for $20 an hour. He was able to get into his home due to VRAP. He's already lost his benefit and can no longer afford the rent. He lives in terror of eviction. An elderly woman was able to move into housing with VRAP, but will not be able to afford it on her fixed income. A single parent family who left a domestic violence situation will not be able to afford her rent with her single person income. A family, this is a heartbreaker, a family of 3 siblings, all in their 60s, walked into Capstone's office in Barrie in November. They had lived in their Barrie City apartment for 30 years, but they were evicted because the house got sold and converted. They came to Capstone because they had nowhere else. Thankfully, in this occasion and in others, we've worked so closely with the state, with VHCB, with all of the resources that you availed for to support our shelter communities. Good Samaritan Haven has converted a hotel along the Berrymont, a motel along the Berrymont-Montpelier Road into the Welcome Center. So this family of 360 siblings with intellectual disabilities were able to find shelter that was appropriate. It's made such a difference what you've done. I will tell you that all of us in the Washington County homeless response team that came together particularly intensively since the pandemic, worked with the community of Berlin that accepted this motel. A member of my board told me, because the city the city of Barre already has a shelter, the town of Barre converted a building and accepted a shelter. One of my board members is on the DRB. He said because of his experience learning about what's going on in our communities, the incredible disparity and the existence of poverty and the growth of poverty in these times made him realize that he needed to be an advocate, and Barrytown accepted this. So it's why I'm here, because many people are afraid of what it would mean to have a shelter in their community. And it's only when we start to understand and be exposed to the breadth and scope of this challenge that we can start understanding the incredible need and the urgency with which you are going to, I know, act to help communities reduce the barriers to building more housing, to building more density, and to accepting a diverse population in their communities. I just want to thank you for all that you have done to support the needs of the most vulnerable throughout this pandemic. It has been extraordinary. It's very hard now knowing the domino. We know yesterday it was announced the Vermont Everyone Eats program has ended. We know the expanded SNAP benefits are ending. I will just let you know, in our food shelf in Barre, which I'd love to have you come meet our Community Kitchen Academy, where we provide not only training to be in the culinary arts, but nutritious meals every day for people at our food shelves, including for our hotels. We have a mobile pantry. But last year, in the first quarter of the year, federal fiscal year, so October through December, we have increased the demand at our food shelf by 65%. So it's really getting worse, not better, unfortunately. Hunger is not over and homelessness is not over. You have a lot on your plates. I know this is an important first start, and I really thank you for all of what you do and what you're going to do in this work and others. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sue. You know, some of us are going on the road and talking to neighbors and constituents and having to start with, is there a crisis? And so, you know, you really brought home in a very important way. You know, it's sometimes feels baffling that we have to start there with folks who are feeling comfortable right now economically, and the gap between, you know, if your home value has increased and your wealth has increased versus if you're renting in a market where home values have increased. It's really, we have to bridge that gap of understanding, and I appreciate you doing that. I didn't know if Ramsey wanted to introduce herself really quickly and just say hello. We appreciate your work.
Hi,
Oh,
I'm Ramsey Papp. I'm the housing program manager for Capstone, and I'm primarily overseeing the staff in the Barre office. So I just wanted to say hi. Thank you for your attention on this very important subject. We're working really hard to help people find housing, stay in the housing that they are able to have, and come up with solutions for something else to do if there isn't housing available and they have nowhere to go. Also, the services that we try to connect people with are really important and valuable as well. So I'm happy to answer any kind of questions. Just an update from Rick DeAngelis at the Good Samaritan Haven just let us know last night in Washington County, his most recent numbers they came up with were 345 in the motels, emergency shelters and apartments, 107. And at the moment, about 20 unsheltered for a total of 475 in Washington County. Luckily, there's a warming shelter open, a couple warming shelters open now. So the unsheltered count has gone down in, recent weeks due to that. So thank you for having us.
Thank you. And every one of those is a person, it might be a child, and so we're really great. Senator Brock.
Thank you. I believe earlier in your testimony, you mentioned something to the effect that many of the people who are being affected with actual and potential eviction believed, understood, or were told that this was a program that would provide them with some continuing relief. If that's the case, is that the case? Did I understand correctly what you had mentioned, or did I misunderstand?
No, Senator, and I don't know where I'm looking at.
Right
so-
here.
Oh, hi, Senator.
Right here.
So the Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which is administered by the State Housing Authority, was intended to support applicants for 18 months. So, but what we learned in October, I believe, and so the expectation was those for a full 18 months. And this has been going on over a period of 2 years. So many people have completed their 18 months, but many were just starting. And then the announcement that the money essentially was running out more quickly than the state had anticipated. So that 18 months that they thought they had to fill their savings account, to find that job, that better job, to be able to afford that rent was shortened. And that's a complex discussion.
But the uptick, I mean,
Well,
it was so
It is a
positive.
complex discussion, but if my understanding is that is what if that is what people were told, what I'm really getting at is, did this go so far as to create a contractual commitment that this is what the state would do based on the promises it made to those people?
I think you'll need to talk to the state about the answer to that question. I know that legal aid will also be testifying before you, and you should ask them that question. They're working hard, I think, to help various tenants in situations, and I think it varies. And just so you understand, the money went to the landlords. But if the landlord didn't buy in, then it came into the tenants themselves. So I don't have the answer to, I don't want to go on the record with answering that important question.
No, I
Thanks
think it's
so
a
much.
critical question in terms of the state's obligation relative to those tenants, and I think it's something we should pursue.
Okay,
Can
thank you.
can I just say a quick thing about that? I maybe I shouldn't go on record as just saying it, but I do believe the wording did not say unequivocally you get 18 months. It was potentially up to 18 months,
I see.
and that changed throughout. But just to understand that, it's confusing to people when they see those things, because people will expect certain things and they'll see it. So it changed a lot of times. So the wording in the application says up to 18 months.
Thank you.
We've already moved our last witnesses, and but we do hope to come visit you. And-
Good, yes, at the end of the session or anytime.
Right,
On a Monday,
yeah.
we would love to have you.
I
That's
know,
great.
this committee might like weekday, it's a short visit.
It's close.
Yes,
very busy.
that's the benefit as well, but we also know that you're doing great work, so thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yes, and
Thank you for your work. We
Yeah.
love partnering you, and hopefully we'll hear about micro business later.
John, Adam.
There's one right downtown that can fix your
I
phone.
So we will still try to give you this
Fix mine.
15 minutes. We're definitely continuing to run behind.
Okay, I do have some slides for the committee. I don't know the best way to.
Oh, okay.
Scott, send them to Scott.
Scott has them.
Scott, can get the slides up. You want to start and introduce yourself, and we'll get the slides up.
Sure, great.
You can advance them for.
Okay, awesome. I'm John Adams, Director at the Center for Geographic Information and part of the Agency of Digital Services. I was asked to give some history on the framework of American planning and zoning, which is more than I can do in the next
Yes, I know, right?
15 minutes.
Possibly.
Not to mention that I'm Canadian, so my American history is not always the best, but I did pull together a few slides that I thought all of you might find interesting, providing some context on that. I also do volunteer on our city's planning commission here in Montpelier, which I believe Senator Cummings also did.
Many years.
And you're also Azalea's dad.
I'm also Azalea's dad,
Dear you to
Oh,
us, so.
Then you're my neighbor.
and I'm also Senator Cummings' neighbor.
So many roles. Beauty of Vermont.
Also, after Sue Minter left her position, ended up working at DHCD. So a little bit quickly beforehand around what VCGI does. In terms of summarize what we do in statute into these 3 points here. We build some of our foundational data sets that are relied upon by many people. We coordinate or lead the development of the use of the state's geographic information system. So we work with a lot of different agencies, department, and make sure that we don't have duplications of effort and make sure people are working together. And then we try to empower data access and visualization and use, and hopefully maybe that's what we do a little bit of today. If you go to the next slide, you'll see 3 of our core programs. We manage the statewide property parcel data, as well as our ortho imagery and our statewide LiDAR program. So LiDAR is a technology where we collect very high resolution elevation data. We scan the face of the earth using technology like bats do with echolocation, and then we get very precise points here. And all 3 of these are actually very helpful in terms of housing, planning housing, all of them are used very widely for building technologies. Next slide. We've been around for around 30 years, which is wild. Looking at our annual report from 1992, entire database fit on a number of floppy disks. We had 107 total customers, and we would get mail orders and send out our database on floppy disks. If you go to the next slide, as of this year, we have around 80,000 users, so quite a bump up from 117 and over 17 terabytes of data. We no longer mail out floppy disks. A lot of our data is now streamed online in the same way that you can stream a movie, you can stream our web services, and they're provided in such a way that anyone can take them, build their own maps, and they're all pulled from the same service. So you're getting things from the same authoritative source. There's also reference here to the geodata portal, where we have our partners publish all of the data and find it. And there is, I believe you mentioned that in the bill. So I'll switch gears now and go into a little bit of the background of planning, zoning, and history, and give you a very, very brief history of land use patterns and some of those related policies in Vermont. If you look at this map here, or these 2 maps here, you'll notice this is the point is the population distribution 1850 and then in 1830. And what's notable is population size didn't actually change that much. But what you'll notice is that it's concentrated in our villages and downtowns. So we went from a mostly agrarian society to one that was industrializing, coming into our villages and downtowns, and that wasn't unique to Vermont. That was happening all over the country. This time was also when we started to see some of the first zoning laws in the country coming from starting in bigger cities, dealing with focusing on public health issues. You imagine all these people coming into these central places. We're having fire, we've got sewage, horses, cars, all of these different disease. So that was sort of the impetus for what people started working on in terms of zoning in Vermont. During that time, if you go to the next slide, that work started at Norwich University by the name of K.R.B. Flint, professor there, big proponent of ski joring, which is hooking up to a horse and skiing. And he wrote, if you go to the next,
water skiing in a funny way. The position of the human is so bizarre.
I think it was a demonstration sport in the Olympics, so it didn't take. And he authored Town Planning, a program for civic preparedness for Vermont communities. And in it, he took this sort of conventional wisdom at the time, was, you know, we need to separate out these uses. That led the way to, if you go to the next slide, the 1921 Planning Act, which enabled municipalities to create zones and separate uses and set things like building heights. It didn't, you know, that was, you know, that was conventional wisdom at the time. That the publication was actually very, very interesting. If you go to the next slide, you know, it talks about really gets into the weeds on fundamentals of road economics, talks about needing Vermonters to visualize this, which is kind of amazing at the time, and what we try to do now. So some very, very wonky stuff. It wasn't just the, like, we need to separate out uses. It was also the precursor to the next, or probably the first big statewide planning effort. Go to the next slide. Which was from the Vermont Commission on Country Life, a rural program, program for the future. Ultimately, that, you know, ended up, despite his emphasis on looking at the road economics and trying to be as efficient as possible, leading to emphasis on building as many highways as rapidly as possible. It's also a time that planning and zoning was, some of these ideas or efforts were being co-opted by other more unfortunate ideas. If you go to the next slide, you know, this report is probably most famously known for Henry Perkins and the ideas that would lead to the castration of hundreds of Vermonters. We go to the next slide. Nationally, zoning was challenged to the Supreme Court. It was upheld in a case of the village of Euclid, Ohio versus Antelope Realty, which is led to the term of Euclidean zoning. A lot of people think it has to do with Euclidean geometry. It doesn't. It has to do with Euclid, Ohio. And the case was actually about an industrial expansion of an industrial area into residential. And you know, some of that, there was some merit to some of that concern. I think a lot of people would agree. One of the interesting pieces of this, though, is if you read the Supreme Court decision, keep in mind this wasn't about multi-family housing or apartments. They write about how, you know, that multi-family housing ends up being a parasite on single-family residential districts. So there's this shift there from focusing on public health and nuisance to ulterior motives. So if we go to the next slide, in Vermont, you know, we didn't see widespread adoption of a lot of zoning laws. We did see some. Next slide is should take us 1968. That created our current enabling statute, so Chapter 117 came out of the Planning and Development Act of 1968. It was also the result of work, go to the next slide, from publication Vision and Choice, published in 1968, which has some really interesting maps. This is a cartographic technique we call scaring people with maps. You know, it reminds me of, I don't know if you've seen the movie like Canadian Bacon, where Canada is like, they're saying Canada is going to invade the US, and there's a map with maybe Syria right down. It kind of reminds me of this. And you know, they're saying like this is what urban trends will, all Vermont will be developed if trends continue. There was no way this was actually going to happen. If you go to the next slide, you'll see what was actually the case, and we would have had to have something like 18 million people come to Vermont. We wanted the urban extent to be that big, according to the definition of urban extent then. So, but nevertheless, it did lead to I think one of the more laudable or our primary land use planning goal. On the next slide, you'll see planning. Maintaining our historic settlement pattern of compact villages surrounded by rural countryside. You go to the next slide, you'll see some of the other sort of planning milestones that sort of followed up and built on that, including Act 200, which set the planning and zoning goals and set the enable municipalities to zone. It doesn't require them to, and if they do choose to, then they do need to adhere to those goals. In terms of our progress, if we go to the next slide, you'll see try to kind of replicate that 1930 map in terms of what our population or development since then, how that's happened. You'll see it's sort of spread out a little bit more, a lot of more concentration in and around Chittenden County. One big difference, if you go to the next slide, is people used to live and work in these same places. This is a map showing the daytime population, which shows it are more concentrated in certain areas. So a lot of our development patterns are dictated about transportation options and economic opportunity. We go to the next slide, you'll see sort of the distribution of jobs in the state, and you'll see another part sticking out there is that greater Burlington area, that concentration of jobs there. We go to the next slide and see county population growth. So you see, predominantly the majority of growth over the past half century happening in and around Chittenden County in Vermont. If we go to the next slide, you can see here on the right, or depending on where you're sitting, I guess on the left, this is a population change from 2010 to 2020. And this is some work showing commuter analysis and sort of our economic or sort of job zones and how they're connected. And you can see how population growth tends to focus in and around where people can drive to the greater Burlington area. And this is, has been a trend across the country where growth in jobs are focused in on metropolitan areas. You move to an economy based on information services. If we go to the next slide, you'll see, last decade is the first one that rural America actually lost population. Those areas in blue are counties that have lost population. See Vermont, all those, except for those what Buckingham County did. But if we go to the next slide, we live in maybe a different world now. And as of last year, for the first time in many years, we saw that trend reverse in Vermont counties. We started to see growth where we haven't in the past. And if we go to the next slide, I think there are a lot of interesting things for us to consider. We looked at travel to workplace and how that's changed since March 2020. You see that initial big drop, and then this continues out until October of this year. We've seen it has stayed relatively steady. Vermont being on that lower end in terms of people returning to the office, but staying consistently around that 25% where that baseline was. And that, if we go to the next slide, we also see changes in housing price value. So, going out further from our large metropolitan areas, we've seen a big increase in price and in value in those areas. And on the left here is just the sales price of a median residence in Vermont, as well as the 25th and 75th percentile. I don't think I need to tell the committee how much there's a need for housing. We've heard that from pretty much everyone here, but I thought these would be some charts of data you might find interesting, showing the spatial distribution sort of regionally and how that's changed. So I believe that's what I have. Here's some references if you want to check out any of those old publications. And then the last slide is just a link to our annual report as well.
Thank you, 70%.
Have you, John, I know you've done a lot of this after the Vermont VHFA conference, a lot of us were very keen on doing a zoning map of Vermont because we're way behind on having that available. Have you done any work on that, mapping out Vermont zoning? And depicting it compared to the rest of the country, or just getting Vermont data all in one place visually?
We did have a project with the regional planning commissions a few years ago where they did compile all the zoning data from the municipalities. And if you were to go into the geodata portal now, type in zoning, you would get over 500 zoning districts. So we did it. It's a bit of a jungle and hasn't been maintained, or it's been maintained to different degrees of consistency. So bringing them all into one map certainly is possible. What that would show you, I'm not exactly sure, where you have 200 and, well, not all municipalities have zoning, but it would take some work to try to normalize it so that it can make any sense to somebody looking at it, as opposed to zoning district from every different municipality, which they all mean something slightly different, right?
Right, but is that something we could begin to work on together?
I think in terms of the language in the bill, I would probably recommend something a little bit different or more specific. And I think a key partner there would likely be the regional planning commissions. I don't think municipalities have.
But
would all
we
have
should
the
chat
capacity.
with you, yeah, on that, because it would be, because it is one of our challenges, is the variety and the large size of our lots. I mean, I think we have the largest lot size in the country, and just looking at how you could help us with this housing, particularly housing need, it would be, that is certainly one of the things we're addressing. So I'm just curious, you know, what you had already and how that could help us.
We have a good base. There would still be, I think, a lot of work needed to make it so that it's useful. And I think, you know, working with the RPCs, we can think about what some of those actions would be.
Can I?
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm trying to be really quick. Thank you, this is great. I really appreciate all this data. Do you probably are able, I would think, to have, to show a map of all of the water and sewer
Yes.
permitted facilities in the state? I would think, maybe.
So we do have what I think the committee would probably be most interested in is the sewer service areas.
Yeah, and water.
And it would be great if we had both.
And we have a sewer service area map that was developed a number of years ago. I think it's probably pretty good, but it's not perfect and hasn't been maintained, nor would I call it sort of an authoritative map of where these areas are.
Okay.
So there's a good starting point, but no one sort of currently owns that or maintains it.
Oh,
And then I don't believe we have to the same extent for water, which can get a little trickier in terms of what constitutes public water. That we definitely, I think, believe have like the permits mapped out. But again, it's one of those, in order for it to be useful or for you to make sense of it, we probably would need some somewhere.
okay. It would be really helpful to have that. So do you manage the ANR atlas, or is that
We
is that
don't.
part of your?
Some of our colleagues do,
Okay.
and we work closely with them. One of the nice things is the way we have things set up is that they would pull some of our layers. For example, the parcel layer, you can find in our atlas, and it's all coming from the same server. And similarly, some of the permits that ANR and other that they manage, we can use their map services in some of our maps.
Okay. And then just one more thing, on the commuting patterns, that's really interesting. I live in Brattleboro, and our town did a study, and we found that as many folks commute to Keene, New Hampshire as commute to Brattleboro. And you don't have data shown, at least for New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and I would think over here, people are commuting to New York. Is it possible to get that data? Okay. Because that's just really helpful to the
Yeah.
economics, you know, when we're tied, because we look at our region
Right.
a lot of times and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad we had you in because you're kind of an underutilized resource and in a lot of these spaces. So you're ready. I think this, this spatial information is really helpful, and getting away from anecdotal and the bleeding maps, it's extremely helpful to us. I think it'll be really helpful when we talk about wastewater and sewer, just like there's a lot of that section is receiving a lot of questioning and pushback, and just better understanding what we're looking at would be really helpful, especially as it relates to these jobs and population centers and the percentage of people who can live where they work, but not sort of hollowing out our other communities will be interesting.
Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up with what we have, what we don't have, and what the caveats or shortcomings.
That'd be great.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you. All right, thanks, John.
Thanks. This was always
This
good.
is
to
really
have you.
good. Thanks. The history was great, especially for a Canadian.
Like
I mean-
Taylor,
Our
thanks.
grandchildren are Canadian.
No, Canadians are great.
Thanks for
We want more
patience.
Of course.
Yeah, so, and Charlie, I imagine you're just here to observe and.
Yeah, still chime in, I'm
Great.
sure.
Yeah.
So I'm Taylor Newton, I'm the planning program manager, at County Regional Planning Commission. I manage essentially the non-transportation planning staff at CCRPC. So mostly land use planning, emergency management, that sort of thing. Before working at CCRPC, I worked at Northwest Regional Planning Commission as the planner there. My focus has always really been on land use planning. So I worked there for 6 years, and before that, I was a zoning administrator and town planner in the town of Milton for 3 years. So I'm coming at this bill from a land use kind of zoning perspective. That's where my expertise lies. I was asked to talk to you about zoning mechanics, which isn't really a term we use, but I'm going to bring you someplace. But if you want to bring me somewhere else in terms of my testimony, that's okay. I want to start just kind of talking about a big question we're asking ourselves in the planning field. That's all Bill really tries to directly get to sort of solutions regarding, and that's how much is planning and zoning led to the housing shortage, not just in Vermont, but nationwide. How much has it led to segregation over the long term? And you're going to hear one opinion from me today as a representative from CCRPC. You're going to hear other opinions from other planners probably over the course of taking testimony the next couple of weeks. Just trying to underscore that there's a variety of opinions in the field. We are quite united in one voice. So from there, let's talk about zoning, the mechanics of zoning. I'm going to break it down really into 3 different categories in terms of how we do planning and zoning in Vermont. We start with planning. We start with the writing of the municipal plan, the comprehensive plan. We're pretty good at planning in Vermont. Municipalities are pretty good at working with their regions to determine areas we want to see grow, areas we want to protect. We're solid in the planning part. We've always been that way since I think the 60s and 70s. From there, we move into coding, writing our zoning, actually making rules based on the planning that we've done. It's there where we start to break down a bit. We don't always have rules that will create places that we've planned for. And I think some parts of the bill target that issue. From there, we move into actually putting the rules into motion, development review. Folks come in to apply to build something. I think there we also have some issues, mostly around kind of redoing the planning work at development review and negotiating. And a lot of that planning work needs to be done at the planning stage, not on a case-by-case basis during development review. From there, I think we're in the state, we've done a good job about how to regulate, create rules for single-family homes, and to kind of regulate larger developments, both in rural and urban places, large PUDs, single-family homes, large apartment buildings. It's the missing middle that is the kind of housing we're not seeing, and we're not seeing that because of some regulatory barriers. And I think the project we worked on with ACCD a few years ago, the Enabling Better Places Guide, has a lot of the zoning solutions on how to make missing middle housing happen in that guide. And so just to, I think a lot of you folks have experience on local planning commissions. You've got some sense of local zoning. So I'll throw some terms at you. Let me know if you want me to explain what they mean. But I think some types of zoning rules that prevent missing middle housing really revolve around the density standard. And how many
The what standard?
The density standard,
Oh, right.
and how many units we can get per acre essentially, particularly in our smaller villages. And that's typically tied to minimum lot size. Most municipalities, it's 1 unit per the minimum lot size. Not everyone. Some municipalities are more sophisticated, but that's one rule that is difficult in terms of preventing missing middle housing. A lot of municipalities have rules about the number of structures on lots. A lot of municipalities only allow 1 principal structure per lot. We're not talking about that here in the bill. But that can prevent certain types of missing middle housing, those cottage courts, those collections of small homes on one lot. A lot of times to be able to do that in municipalities, you got to do a PUD. And you've got to go through 3 rounds of review, and that can take 1.5 years, and it gets very complicated very fast. And there's a lot of discretion in terms of what the DRB controls through a process like that. Dimensional standards are always an issue, particularly on kind of edges of places. And by dimensional standards, I mean setbacks, height, density itself, and the ability to reduce density, particularly through conditional use review. DRBs have a lot of discretion in conditional use review. A lot of times multifamily housing is subject to conditional use review. And therefore, DRBs can say you need a larger lot size, you need X number of fewer units as a part of your proposal. Height, lot coverage, building coverage. That's essentially, how much of your lot can be covered by building, how much of your lot can be covered by impervious surface. If you want to keep scale of building small, you have very low percentage numbers there, and you can really control. Even if your use table says you get multifamily housing, those coverage requirements can really restrict how large that housing can be. And then we have infrastructure issues too: water, sewer, stormwater. Those are the barriers, that really quick list of barriers to missing middle housing. From there, we can go a couple different ways. We can talk about what the bill doesn't do in terms of zoning to kind of highlight what we're not touching in terms of what municipalities have control over still, which is a lot. Or we can talk about the bill itself, and I can talk to you about why I think some provisions are good. Do you have a preference?
Start with
I think that
good. Start with what's good.
start with what's good, but we should get to the bill.
Yeah, what's in the bill.
Yes,
Like
yes,
what's good
yeah.
in the bill and why
Alright.
it's important.
So here's
Not wrong.
We do have 5 minutes. so-
Okay, I'm gonna
And
be
you've
really-
been super
thank you.
patient, but I'm just-
Thank you. So here's what I like about the bill. I think, we've talked about the bill a lot about how big the changes are. I actually think the changes are pretty small and incremental. We're gonna specifically the 5 units per acre standard, and then the 3-4 units by right in areas served by water and sewer, and then what your bill doesn't have, but each 68 does have, and that's essentially duplex by right everywhere. I think those 3 things are actually going to lead to incremental changes in neighborhoods across Vermont over a very long period of time. Things will not change overnight. I think that it is preferable that we have these kind of baseline rules and we allow neighborhoods to slowly change over time, as opposed to in our larger cities, geographically targeting certain geographic areas for monumental change, dramatic upzonings, from 7 units an acre, in the New York and Burlington to 30. That's a big deal. But here we're just talking about single family homes to duplexes and allowing existing neighborhoods to slowly infill. A lot of people like their single family homes. They're not going to change them to duplexes. They haven't done it with accessory apartments either. But it's going to allow for slow change over time, a slow evolution of neighborhoods. The duplex rule in particular, I think, is important because that's everywhere. That's not just in water and sewer areas. So that's an opportunity shared by every municipality in Vermont. It's not just the areas served by water and sewer. So everybody's got some responsibility there.
But the concern with that is you could get a lot of building not in the downtown and village center,
Mhm.
which is where we're really wanting to drive it.
What I would push back on that how I would push back on that would be that in a lot of those really rural places, the minimum lot size is very large. And
True,
so,
but it's just contributing to more out rather than more in.
Okay, but when we're talking villages, how many villages have water, municipal water and sewer? That's where we're targeting the mini TIFs because they can't afford, they've got such a small tax base, they can't get the loans to put in the water and sewer. So we're really talking your larger towns and cities.
and because there's more lots there too, you're going to see more evolution of duplexes in those areas than you would in the rural areas. I understand the concern. I think it's valid, but I don't think it's going to change the character of those rural places in an immense way in a very over the mid or long term, honestly. I don't have much time, so I'm going to move on. The by right zoning portion of the bill, I think, is probably the most important. It's really about making sure that what we plan for gets built. I also think that it's important because it provides transparency to all parties. It's very clear what we plan for gets codified and that's what gets built. It's not this renegotiation on the back end, which I think creates a lot of conflict and then lots of lack of trust in the system itself. And so I think, the by right part of the bill is the most important. Been a lot of talk about parking. I know that folks are really upset about the parking and there's been the question of like, what is the problem we're trying to solve? The problem we're trying to solve without pointing any fingers is that, there are some municipalities that require 2 parking spaces per unit for multifamily, regardless of how many units. And that can effectively prevent multifamily housing from being built in a lot of places. I'm happy to point fingers, not on the record, for all these things. Even at our own municipalities, even, municipalities zoning I've written in Franklin County and Chittenden County and Grand Isle County. Those are I think the big things. With parking, for us, it is just a minimum. Developers can always build more parking if they want. I think most developers will. It's really just trying to get the municipality out of the regulation of private parking, recognizing that municipalities, especially the ones like Montpelier, have really complicated parking situations, but we're never going to solve the problem. It's going to be constantly evolving. We're going to have to do parking management plans in our downtowns and our villages. We're always going to have to be looking at the issue and figuring out how to create solutions. But I think just regulating the private sector to an excessive extent is preventing housing growth. That's what I've got on the bill on the zoning portions, and I know I'm running out of time. Any questions for me quickly?
This one can answer it later if you want, but form-based code, Winooski has it. I don't know if others have it.
I just managed a project to develop a form-based code for tap corners.
Yeah. Form-based code where you regulate the well, you can explain it better than I can.
You were on the way to doing it. You traditional Euclidean zoning really regulates the use of the building over all things. That's the most important thing. With form-based code, you relax regulation of the use of the building. You instead really highly regulate what the building looks like. And you say, we want building to look like X, and it has certain materials and a certain number of windows. Well, what you put in the building, pretty flexible in most municipalities. There's also provisions about doing administrative review because the rules are usually so straightforward and strict, or should be. That you can speed up review. Some municipalities choose not to do that, but in our region, small scale, Westford has it on their town common. Jericho has it in some areas. But the larger places, more urban places have it too. Burlington, Winooski on kind of the main streets, the gateways, Williston and Taft Corners. And I'm sure I'm missing a few. South Burlington and City Center as well. I think it's a great tool.
Yeah, just what's nice about it is the building can adapt to circumstances over the years, but you do have to find a way to regulate like the external impacts that you don't want. So, but that would be regulated out of the planning.
There's still be code.
Yeah.
Still, but you're regulating the form. You're also really regulating the streetscape itself and what the street looks like, and making sure that it's village scale, downtown scale, not A76 standard. There's A76 standard and that V-Trans standard in the middle of your downtowns.
As you think about, we're hearing we need 40,000 units by 2030. We're hearing, most people want to live close to where they work. Chittenden County would have a huge lift. Do you have a ballpark figure, a goal you're trying to meet at 2030? I know that's a Charlie question, but you know,
It is a
I
Charlie
can
question,
hear the
but
urgency in your
I'll-
voice to
I'll
address this.
start. I mean, we have the Building Homes Together campaign already, where we're trying to set a target of 1,000 units in our region per year, 250 of those being especially affordable. I don't see us stopping that campaign, given the need. We've started to talk to DHFA about what the real goal should be, what the
Yeah.
real need is.
Right.
And I think that's what I can say about that, Charlie.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
It's a good answer. I don't think you've offended anybody in this room. That's really helpful. Thank you for you can tell you have passion for your work and,
More to,
are
Yeah.
trying to get those
Follow.
units built. So
Happy to talk again in the future as you guys start to go through the vote.
right.
thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thanks. And thanks for your patience again.
No problem.
Thank you for your
Thanks.
patience. As you're probably starting to gather, half an hour is a premium in this committee when we're doing a bill that everyone wants to comment on. So we appreciate you being here. Anne, I imagine you were thanks so much. I imagine you're gonna be in the witness
Thanks,
chair
Carol.
first. and-
Thanks, Carol.
slides to put up.
Okay, well then maybe someone else
You have
should
my-
start. Wow, oh, you have it. Okay, great. Okay,
We're coordinated, so.
Okay,
And then
great.
Michelle.
great. And others can join you at the witness area if you'd like. And we heard from Robert, earlier. I don't know if, I think with the half an hour, I'll let you decide, but we did really enjoy hearing from Robert already. And I just we still do have to get to lunch and I can't take that away.
We'll be fast.
Okay.
We just have a few brief slides, just to introduce our work, and then our legislative priorities more generally. Is it okay to get started or?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Okay, we're starting.
Wonderful. Thank you for having us to your committee. For the record, I'm Ann Sasson. I'm the interim executive director of the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition. I've only been there for a couple of weeks, so I'm getting up to speed quickly, I hope. And I'm joined by Michelle Kersey, the chair of our board. So today I'd just like to introduce the organization and talk about our legislative priorities. Next slide, please. So I want to do 4 things in the brief time that we have together. First, I want to give just a very quick overview of the coalition. I'm going to talk about the housing crisis. I know you're well aware of that, so I won't spend too much time going through numbers you've seen many times. Then I want to talk about the opportunity to address this crisis, and then I want to talk a little bit about our specific legislative priorities. And I know you've been thinking as a committee already about this. Next slide, please.
And well-trained by Earhart.
Yes, and I can't even aspire to
We're
fill
coming,
his
You know,
very
let's
large
just
shoes.
mention that
Yeah.
So just in the way of a bit of background, our vision is a future where everyone has a house in which to live with dignity and opportunity. We pursue this vision through 3 related areas: education, advocacy, and outreach. Next slide, please. The Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition brings together more than 100 organizations drawn from across the state. It's existed for more than 35 years, and you can see some of the members that are located in your own district. And our membership includes affordable housing developers, social service providers, as well as other groups. And we're happy to follow up with the full list following today's brief presentation. Next slide, please. So I want to just put some numbers to the crisis, and many of these numbers you've heard already. As we all know, Vermont faces a large and growing housing crisis. You've seen the estimate that we will need 40,000 units by 2030 to bring Vermont to a healthy housing market. As you know, we have the lowest rental vacancy rate in the US and one of the highest rental housing wages in the country. That's a little bit higher in some parts of the state than others. Next slide, please. We also have made strides in addressing the crisis of homelessness, but we have a long way to go. Since the onset of the pandemic, 2,800 households have been exited from homelessness. But the point in time last year, which will be conducted this year today, actually, estimated that we have another 2,780 people experiencing homelessness. We'll have
new numbers in the next couple of months to put to that, but all numbers suggest that we have a lot of work to do to address this crisis. About 13% of those experiencing homelessness are families with children. Next slide, please. But what we really want to talk to you about today is not just the problem, but the opportunity that we see as a coalition to address this crisis. Several of the elements are in place to make headway in the next few years in addressing the crisis. We have evidence-based models that have already been demonstrated in Vermont and in other settings, and we need to scale up these models. Many of the pandemic innovations have shown what's possible, and we can build on the successes of these programs. We all know there's a lot of public awareness of this crisis, and there's political will among lawmakers to address it. Many of you ran on housing as a top priority. You're hearing it from your constituents. We also have a one-time infusion of federal resources that can help to accelerate progress. Next slide, please. So I want to quickly jump to some of the solutions that we've seen over the course of the last few years. I'm not going to talk in detail about any of them, but we can have a broader conversation following the presentation. We've seen Housing for All revenue bond, which is a $37 million bond that leveraged nearly $200 million in additional investments and created more than 800 units, and that included both apartments and homes. The Vermont Emergency Rental Assistance Program helped more than 16,000 people to stay safely housed over the last year. Allocations in the FY22 budget to the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board have leveraged more than $275 million and helped to create more than 1,000 homes. And the Vermont Housing Improvement Program, or VHIP, has helped nearly more than 300 households to access permanent housing. These are all important elements, but they don't get us far enough. We need to build on them as we move forward. Next slide, please. And we've seen progress across the state. As we look across Vermont, we've seen many models of what we need to do more of in the next few years. Next slide, please. We know that while this is a big challenge, we can't house all Vermonters. What we lack is the housing stock to meet the needs of all Vermonters. We have really, really robust evidence that the overwhelming majority of people can be housed. We just don't have enough housing and enough of the right types of housing. Many of the solutions that we need are already in place, but they're not resourced adequately and at the scale that we need. Next slide, please. So there are a few things that we want at high level that we are looking for this year. First, we want to bring some of the solutions that are working to scale. Second, we want to sustain and accelerate the pipeline of development of affordable housing. Next, we want to see sustained investment in policies to reverse the effects of decades of underinvestment and policies that have limited household development. And I know you're thinking a lot as a committee about what those policies might look like. Finally, we think it's critical that we maintain bridges to permanent housing for Vermonters who are unhoused. We need to create bridges into housing, not cliffs into homelessness as we begin to address this crisis. Next slide, please. So let me briefly review our specific legislative priorities, and then I'll invite Michelle to comment further. First, we want to sustain bridges from homelessness to housing. I think it's important to sustain and expand rental assistance programs. We also believe it's critical that we preserve as well as redesign the GA emergency housing program. We know that motels are not permanent solutions that we need, but they're a critical bridge right now that we need to maintain. Next, we want to bring solutions to scale. It's really important to see capital investments in affordable housing paired with investments in social and human services. We'd like to see full statutory funding for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board along with $175 million in capital investments. We really want to see increased funding for supportive and human services, including funding for SASH for All. Finally, we want to see investments in manufactured home communities and farm worker housing. The final priority, we as a coalition support enabling equitable policies and protections. We're supportive of the coalition of zoning reforms that are being laid out. We can talk about the specifics of those following this, and really want to see enhanced tenant protections that are being brought forward. Let me stop there and invite Michelle to join with additional comments.
Can you speak specifically to the tenant protections that you're seeking? Is someone doing that?
Yeah, so we're,
If you just want to introduce yourself.
oh, sorry, I'm Michelle Kersey. I'm the chair of the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition. And we're in favor of tenant protections that give the tenants resources that they need to stay safely housed. One topic that came up yesterday is the idea of rental caps on increasing rents.
Where did that come up yesterday?
We were in a Progressive Caucus meeting, and
Okay.
one of the legislators is being to present that. Be interested in following that, to see where that comes out.
Okay.
I think we're all hearing stories about landlords, doubling rents in some cases, which is forcing people out of their homes, affordability issues. Also making sure that tenants have access to the resources they need if they're facing eviction, in terms of legal representation.
Rental rescue fund
Yeah,
was
yes.
also brought up yesterday.
What was?
A rental rescue fund was being proposed by Vermont Legal Aid yesterday, as well as eviction diversion programs.
Yeah, the eviction diversion programs that Legal Aid is putting out now, we need to work with them on
That
that.
they're putting out?
Well, they had discussed putting forward ideas about eviction diversion programs.
Right,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I'm asking because I think the coalition has the opportunity to add value by building the necessary supports to get these actually moving. I mean, eviction diversion was an idea that came up. The courts have already said we have no capacity to do this. So a lot of these ideas would take another 6 months, I feel like, to build the right stakeholder groups. So we can always put studies in and build that. But I was kind of listening for like post Earhart, what is VAHC's goals or responsibilities for coalescing these ideas? I mean, as you know, with rental caps, people raise huge concerns about what happens to people moving into our communities. 90% of our in-migration is from people of color. So if they come and see huge disparities in the market, we have to contend with that too. So we'd love to hear if you all are helping to bake these ideas for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, these ideas are just starting to come out.
Right.
We're in this very unique moment in time and understanding where the political will is, because this isn't something that would come for a year ago. It is important for us. I also just want to share that, as you know, Earhart has been in the position for 24 years.
Yes.
Hard to replace leadership.
Right, but it's good to think about what is the next phase of this
right.
organization
And
after
so,
that.
yes, and we
Yeah.
are working on what's the next phase of this
Yes.
organization. We do have a legislative subcommittee that's bringing together a lot of voices.
Okay.
Who are familiar with the legislative process, understand what kinds of things are out there, to discuss what the strengths and benefits, as well as potential unintended consequences of different proposals are.
Right, absolutely.
To be aware of what those things are. So
We
as
appreciate
we move forward, we'll certainly be keeping an eye on things and making recommendations.
Great, Senator Clarkson.
Yeah, and I think eviction diversion is a great idea, but I really think we hear from landlords too, and landlords' costs have gone up. And I think anything we do to solve these are going to we're going to have landlords at the table as well.
Agreed.
We're going to have to address their needs. tenants are in many ways very well protected in this state. Many landlords would say too protected. It's not that easy to evict. In some ways, there already is a diversion process in place, not diversion, but just, so I think we are all open to a lot of these solutions. I think we will be more open to them if all parties have already been brought to the table and we have a solution that's worked on together.
And that still needs to happen, I will say. I would
Yeah.
say that what the initial proposal put forward about eviction diversion programs is far from being finished.
Right, and then, and
There's
I.
a lot more conversation.
Yeah, and I dug in to ask, because if someone just said zoning changes, we'd be like, oh, what do you have in mind? And if we didn't have 6 months of a lot of stakeholders being brought in, we wouldn't be at the point where we could talk about, those changes, even if we all believe some of them at least, I don't want to speak for everyone, but some of them really should move forward. So, some work needs to happen outside of session.
Yeah, and in some ways, a lot of this is exacerbated by a lot of the rental buildings that are privately owned being bought by new people. There's been a huge, in the Upper Valley, a huge number of these buildings. We heard in testimony earlier about new owners of these buildings and raising rents. This is a big challenge, and we can't, we don't, so anyway,
Yeah,
we look,
Senator Brock.
Thank you. Very interesting presentation. I understand the issues and suggestions you've raised, but I have a fundamental question, and that is, how do we actually create affordable housing, and how do we define what's affordable? Most of the things that I see here are recommendations and requests for additional funding of one kind or another, and we certainly get that. But the question is, how do we lower the cost of housing? How do we make it more affordable? And also, in terms of definitional, do you have a definition of what is an affordable house in terms of dollars?
Yes. We do. So there's a HUD definition for affordable housing, which is that the cost of housing, total cost of housing, is no more than 30% of an individual's income or household's income. So that's what we use in the industry, the affordable housing nonprofits throughout the state. That is our target number that we use. As far as lowering the costs, again, we're in a really unique time. Construction costs of labor have escalated significantly in the last 2 years. And so everyone out there who is building, whether you're building affordable housing or market rate housing, we're seeing our costs go up significantly. The last numbers I knew, and it's changing all the time, is that the cost of housing was going from about $250 a square foot to somewhere between $400 and $500 a square foot. And we've seen it in practice. I work for Downstreet Housing and Community Development, and we had a project that we got figures on in 2019. And by the time we'd gone through and located all of the funding that we needed for the project in 2021 and were able to go out for final bids, there was an increase of over $250,000 in the cost of construction for what was under a $3 million project at that point, and went over the $3 million mark. And so I know that that's being seen throughout the state.
Right.
And we have no control over that.
Yeah.
And I guess my question really is, what are the things that can be done, or what are the things that perhaps should be looked at as possibilities that could actually lower the cost of construction, that could push back against some of the increases that we're seeing, or find other ways of accomplishing the same goal at less cost? And but the question really is, who's doing that?
Yeah. Well, I will say that, I've had a chance to skim through the bill we put forward about zoning reform, and, some of the cost of construction, especially for the affordable housing nonprofits, is the appeals process. And when you have a project, and Senator Clarkson knows very well.
I know, I loved one of your slides where our new houses at Stafford Commons.
Yes, Stafford Commons went through a 9-year delay in the project, and that costs money. And the longer it takes to get a project from the initial investigatory stages of the project to getting a shovel in the ground adds dollars to the cost. And so shortening that time.
And I think sometimes what we tend to do is conflate affordable and perpetually affordable.
I apologize, I have to get lunch to go to my next lunch.
When you're chair of money committee, you have to leave sometimes a little earlier. But you know, affordable housing versus perpetually affordable housing is a conversation that we constantly need to be vigilant about, because it costs money annually to keep something perpetually affordable. If we incentivize the private market to make something affordable, we don't have the same controls over perpetual affordability. And those controls just simply don't work the same way, because we're not continually giving them money to make perpetually affordable housing available. And we have to take into account 85% of people are in that private market and not in the affordable housing market. So I do think, I don't know, Senator, I don't want to try to answer your question more, Senator Brock, but we should really distinguish in this committee more between what we're talking about as perpetually affordable, which does take annual investment to make it so, and what's affordable when it's put on the market.
Well, I guess my question really goes to the issue of who's looking out for reducing the cost of housing to actually make it affordable? And do we have, in fact, perverse incentives that do the opposite? For example, when we have people who essentially profit based on cost plus, which is often the case in the construction industry, is there an incentive there to do things at a lower cost and for a lower cost result? And who's monitoring and who's watching out for that? That's my question.
So in perpetually affordable housing that's produced by the nonprofit affordable housers in the state, we are under all kinds of regulations. We usually rely on something called the low-income housing tax credit to create new housing. And when we do that, when we put a project out to bid, we don't just bid out to one construction management company. We have to bid out to several construction management companies. And cost containment is a big part of the choice in terms of who we move forward with on projects. So it is actually pretty heavily regulated from that kind of things. But you know, the free market is the free market, and that's not something that we have control over.
I just want to see if there's anything else you wanted to share before we go to questions and hear from Robert.
Yeah, actually, if I can just share, you know, our two top asks at this time go along with the $175 million request that came from the affordable housing providers.
Okay.
Because at this point, the need to create more housing, as you know, from that 40,000 units in the next, you know, 7 years now, that's huge. And our pipelines are challenging to build. And when you start to create a project and it takes 3 to 4 years to go from concept to construction, it takes a while. And if there is a holdup in funding, it will slow things down. And then the other has to do with the cliff of so many people who are currently living in hotels heading into homelessness. We really need to be looking to address that, ensure that they can stay safe and housed.
So that ends in March.
Yes.
I mean, so, here we are almost into February. What are the best ideas that are on the table for how we create more of a slow? And we're going to face this in every one of our programs that has this huge amount of ARPA funding. So this happens to be the first one that we're slamming into this wall. And it's, of course, paired with our workforce challenge and a ton of jobs that are still open, and wanting to get some of these people back into work so they can afford their apartments. It's kind of a circular challenge.
Yes, it is.
So I think, given we're 6 weeks to 8 weeks away from this exploding into a huge problem, what are the best ideas that are on the table? Because we need you guys to come to us with how to solve it. We're happy to enable the solving of it, but I'm not sure we have the solutions to this. We are clear on the problem.
Yes. Yeah. Can you speak to that?
Sure. So the first and most immediate thing we want is to see that that program extended through June 30th, recognizing that that's not a permanent solution, but
So what's the cost to that, and is that in the BAA?
That's a request that we've made through the BAA.
So, and what's that request?
It's 26 million?
It is,
I honestly, I would need to look into that.
Okay, so there, that's what I'm trying to get at, is there has to be an ask in the BAA, and that'll be all state money, I assume, or at least reclaimed money from ARPA from other places, maybe.
yes,
Okay,
and that's the request that several groups have made.
okay, so that's helpful, because so far, hitherto today, all we've had is the VRAP ending is the problem, but we haven't yet heard what some of the thoughts are about how, but that'll just extend it through the original time, right, through the end of the year.
Things like this.
Yeah.
That's through the end of June.
Yeah.
And then to follow on, as a next step, we have a group that has convened to define proposal for the next option beyond June 30th.
Right.
We'll be bringing forth some proposals.
Right, so I think that's a little more helpful because, I mean, I knew there had to be an ask in the BAA, or we don't intimate with the BAA, so that's
Yeah,
great.
actually, Robert, is that something, yeah, you have your hand raised. Robert, do you know, Robert also serves on the steering committee for the Vermont Coalition to End Homelessness. So do you know, Robert, what the official ask was for that?
Right now, I do not have that number right now. I'm sorry, I do not have that number right now. We can follow up and send an email. We'll get that number from Martin Hahn.
I didn't know, Robert, if you, I mean, you sounded like you were letting him make a comment while his hand is raised.
Yes.
We just have a few more minutes, so
Yeah.
I don't know.
Robert, do you have anything else you want to?
Yeah, I just want to make a couple points. I know I'm on Zoom, so I'm just sort of waving in the background. For the record, Robert Little, Director of Community Development, Rural Edge, and Vice Chair of the Affordable Housing Coalition. I just wanted to respond to Senator Brock a little bit with, you know, how do we bring down housing costs? Usually we see housing costs stabilize when there's a healthy vacancy rate, which is typically around 5%, and we are well under that. So increasing housing stock is going to help stabilize that market some, hopefully by increasing a vacancy rate to a healthy rate, one that's not going to hurt landlords particularly, but is going to, having vacant units for people to move into is going to help establish a healthy market because there won't be the inflated costs that come with that. One thing that we've done to help bring down costs that we haven't seen so much recently is we're trying to scale projects. So now we're not looking at projects even in the Northeast Kingdom really below 20 units. Just because we can't be doing, you know, 3 and 4 unit developments just because of the costs that are associated with pre-development and otherwise. We really need to scale projects. And that's also in response to the housing crisis. So I think a lot of nonprofit housing developers are looking at scale a lot more than has ever been looked at in the past. So those are just a couple things I wanted to bring up, but at the same time, one thing the nonprofit housing developers do that others might not is what we would call, and Gus Seeley talked about this morning, is the adaptive reuse. So looking at what he called the white elephant buildings, the ones that have been vacant for a long time, underutilized or not utilized at all. It's typically the nonprofit housing developers that go in and do the work to bring those buildings back online to serve the community. So there's also, in addition to the housing impact that it also has a large community impact. Re-establishes that building as a part of typically the downtown, and also raises the tax base on it when it's typically not utilized. So those are some points, and I'm happy to follow up offline to continue this conversation because I don't want to keep you from lunch. I know what happens when I get kept from lunch. So just wanted to raise those points.
All the meetings that are pushed into the lunchtime.
But some of us also really do need to eat on time. So yeah.
If I could just
wrap
add
up.
one additional comment to Robert's comments about investing in downtown. So investment draws more investment.
Mhm.
You know, and so if you put forth the initial investment and you start to see economic development coming back to our downtowns, more for-profit developers will come in and do the same.
Great.
We love those downtown tech.
Yes, much appreciated. And I hope you can hear that, you know, when we think coalition, we think you know, workshop ideas, bring them back to us because, you know, as you started to say, there are solutions. And we just, you know, we run on a tight time frame. We speak to the appropriations committee and we're balancing, you know, a lot of priorities as we all try to work together to solve this. Senator Brock, did you want to say anything before we finish?
No,
or-
thank you. I've got to run to another meeting at 12 noon.
Okay,
So
yes.
thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah.
Randy,
thank
feel
you.
better.
Thank
Yes,
you.
Feel better. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. And
Thank you,
please
guys.
feel free to reach out to us anytime, any questions. You know.
Great.
Are we all fly?